Hello friends, welcome back to day 12 of our 12 block sampler quilt. This is our very last block and it's going to be a pretty simple one. You might even recognize it because we made a smaller version of it when we did the pot holders, the week of pot holders back, I believe right after Thanksgiving. So I hate to repeat things, but I love this block so much that I thought it needed a place in our quilt, and I'm sure that there are some of you who didn't see that video anyway. So what you need is 4 6.5-inch blocks. Now they can all be the same color. I kind of like to have 2 of each with them being a similar colorway. So these are both pretty dark. And then you need 8 3.5-inch background squares. And this is a pretty block by itself, and it's also a pretty block in a whole quilt of blocks, just like it. So I think this would make a gorgeous quilt where you had like all blue tones or all pink tones or whatever your favorite color is for these pieces, and then just a basic background. Okay, the first thing we want to do is take our 3.5-inch blocks, and on the back side, which on white they're in the back side, at least not that I know of, we want to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner. Okay, bear with me while I draw all these lines. Okay, now they're ready to be put together. Before we go much further, I just want to mention some general things that I mention in all the videos, just for those who are new. I'm using a fabric called Buzzworthy by Canvas Studios, and my background is Kona White cotton. I've been using a layer cake and trying to squeeze all I could out of it. I had to, limit everything to 10 inches or shorter because I didn't have any yardage to go with it. And I had to finally break out my second layer cake for these blocks. I had fabric left. I just didn't have enough big pieces that matched left. So I did have to break my second one out, but that's okay. The secret to a pretty block that lays flat and is the right size and all that is accurate cutting and accurate seam allowance, accurate sewing. So check your seam allowance to make sure you're making a 1/4 inch or even a scant 1/4 inch. I have found that I do much better with a scant 1/4 inch. My blocks tend to be too small in the end, ever so slightly, if I use a full 1/4 inch. So you may find the same is true. I recommend you starch and iron your pieces before you start. And I use something called Best Press. I put it in this squirt bottle, but it's called a starch alternative, whatever that means, but it's a very lightweight starch type, and I like it very much. It doesn't leave residue, and it's not stiff. I use a leader before I start, which here's a real tacky looking one with lots of threads on it, just a scrap of fabric that I start sewing on before I chain my pieces. This gets you off to a running start. It makes sure that you don't have any wads of thread under your block when you first start, or it doesn't get caught in your feed dogs or any of that, and you don't have to backstitch when you do that. I'm using a 2.5 millimeter stitch length, and that won't come out without some effort. So that's another reason you don't have to back stitch. I picked all the blocks for this quilt based on their simplicity. When I first started quilting, I've been sewing for 58 years, and I mean addicted to it bad. And I only started quilting about 15 years ago. My claim to fame has always been children's clothes. And so when I started quilting, all the beginner quilting patterns were just a bunch of squares like this, sewn together to make like a checkerboard. And I thought that was the boringest thing. I wanted to jump in there and start with the hardest block. And I did try that, and it didn't work out so well. So I did have to back up. But I know that there are a lot of simple blocks out there that give a lot of interest to a quilt, and they make that quilt look like it was very complicated to put together. And that is my intent by bringing you these blocks. If you find one that you like better than the others, make an entire quilt out of it, and people will be so impressed. So that's how I picked them. They don't have anything to do with each other. They may not even go together, but we're going to have a nice sampler when we're done. They are 12 and a half inch blocks that will sew down to 12-inch blocks when we sew on all our sashing and our borders and all that. And when we stitch a seam, we usually iron it to one side or the other, and as opposed to ironing it open, and that's to give the quilt strength. If you've ever had a seam allowance ironed open and you tugged on it and you could see the stitches, the stitches are all that's holding that together. When you iron both sides to one direction, and especially when you quilt on top of that, it won't come apart. So that's why we iron to one side or the other. And we try to iron when we have two seams coming together that have seams that meet. We want one seam allowance ironed one way and one the other way to reduce bulk. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and that's okay. And sometimes it's just best to iron it open because it gets too complicated otherwise. But for the most part, that's our reasoning behind ironing to one side or the other. That was something that was a real tough adjustment for me as a clothing seamstress. That just didn't make sense, but now it does. Okay, we are ready to start sewing our block. And what we're going to do with right sides together, we are going to put a block, one of our background squares in this corner and one down in this corner. And, excuse me, I'm going to pin this like in two different places to hold it real square, because the secret of a good block on this is that this and this is lined up perfectly. And then you're going to sew down the line you drew, or even just a hair to the inside of that line. But you don't want to, if you sew on this side of the line, your block is good. When you open it, it's going to be a little bit small. So just like with a scant 1/4 inch, I like to stitch just right on this side. Now, you want the line that you drew going from side to side. You don't want it going from corner to out in the middle of your block, okay? So make sure that it is side to side and it's as perfectly square as you can get it with your corner. And I like to put 2 pins in each of these to hold it square. Okay, let's pin the other 4. Okay, now that everything's pinned, I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine. I'm going to start with my leader, sew through that, then chain all these, one right after the other, and then I'll come down and do the other side. So let's get this stitched. Okay, let's cut these apart. Now then, we want to double check to see if we open it up, will it cover that square? And it does, or that one does. So that's why I like to stitch just a hair on this side of the red line, because if it's extra, I can trim it off. But if it's not, it's going to make our block too small. Okay, I'm going to trim all these to about 1/4 inch. Now we're going to open it up and iron it, and we should have a perfect 6.5 inch square. I'm going to iron 2 of them towards the dark fabric and 2 of them towards the light fabric. I don't like to iron towards white, but that's the only way our seams are going to be going opposite direction later on. So let's iron these 2 towards the dark. And these we're going to iron towards the light. Okay. Now we're going to put these opposite each other and these 2 opposite each other. And it makes a nice pretty X. And you can imagine the pattern with more X's all the way down. Now then, we want to sew these 2 together and sew these 2 together like we've been doing all along. And to get everything to match up right, because we've got some angled seams, we want to make sure that we're nesting that block so that one seam's going this way, one's going that way, and the actual stitching is right on top of each other. So I'm going to take these over to the sewing machine and sew both sides 1/4 inch. Okay, I've got those 2 seams done, and I'm checking. This one looks almost perfect. This one, not so much. But I could take it back and try to adjust it, and I think I will, because this would be an easy adjustment. So hang tight with me while I rip this seam out and adjust it a little bit. Okay, now it looks much, much better. So I'm glad I did that. It was an easy fix. 2 things. Don't ever be afraid to take a seam out and redo it. If it bugs you, and if it's going to bug you forever, you'll never like the quilt when you're done. And the other thing is, never be afraid to leave it in if it's not going to bug you, because I promise you, nobody but you will ever notice it. So be easy on yourself. All right, I'm going to turn these over. I had to clip my little seam to fix that, but that's okay. I'm going to sew one of them one direction and the other direction. And so this time we've got 3 places to match. So I think I may even pin it. We want our center seam nesting there, so one's pointing one way and one the other. And our stitching is right on top of each other. Then we've got these blocks that we want the diagonal seam to set right on top of each other, and they should also be going opposite directions, their seam allowance. I hope my block turns out the right size because I'm getting some shortages here on the end. Okay, we'll set this one right on top of itself. Okay, this end's coming out just fine. Let me make sure that I ironed this good enough. I'll take this out. Sometimes if you don't have it ironed good enough, it'll appear short, but that was ironed fine, so that isn't the problem. Okay, when you have multiple places that have to line up like this, sometimes you kind of have to stretch or squeeze to get them. That's why you want to match up your intersections. Now, you don't want to have to stretch it a whole lot, but you kind of want to force fit it so all your corners look good. Okay, let's go sew this one last seam, and then we'll see how good I did on getting my 12.5-inch block. Okay, here's our block. Let's iron our last seam. Just to one side or the other, it doesn't matter which. And now I'm going to make sure I pull it out so that it's as big as it's supposed to be. But I also don't want to stretch it out shape. Okay, I suspect that this corner is going to be a little off on mine, but I'll just have to compensate for it when I do the sashing. Okay, let's put this seam on a line. And one thing I forgot to tell you, there is an easier way to do this, and that's to have a 12.5-inch square ruler like these are. And then you can just line up your lines and trim around it. I don't have one of those. I think I better get one. But you need to know how to do it without too. So, all right. Let's see here. Whoa, my iron fell. Yeah, this is going to be just a hair shy down here. I can't even trim anything off there, but I'll show you how I compensate when we do the sashing. Just a sec, maybe it's not completely square. Okay. around this way so I can. I'm not going to trim anything that direction. Or this direction, because I'm just about 1/8 of an inch shy on all sides. So when I sew the sashing on, I'm going to take a pretty narrow seam on the block and on the block part of it to compensate for it. Okay, this concludes our blocks. Isn't that a pretty block? I sure like it. Let me show you if I can find it. The one I made in my other colorway. And you can imagine if they were the same colorway, how pretty. And you could use something even in here that's not a background print, that's just something that's in contrast with the rest of your X. But let's take a little parade here through all our blocks that we've made. There's that one. There's that one. Uh-oh, that one didn't belong in this. There's this one. Somebody told me this was called a churn dash block, I believe. It's a traditional block. I really like that one. I really like this star one too. I really like all of them, actually. Here's that one. This one has a lot of little pieces, but it's still pretty, I mean, it takes a little longer to sew it up, but it's still not difficult. I really like this one too. That's a traditional block that I've seen a lot of. Same with this one. This one is probably the next one I want to make an entire quilt out of because I love the secondary pattern that forms in it. This one, I like this one a lot too. And I like this block. I should turn it this way for you. But I like it better in different colors when you can just tell that part of it's leaf and part of it's the flower. But it's still pretty here. Then there's this one. And this makes a real pretty repetitive pattern when you put a bunch of blocks together. Now, when you're doing these pattern ones, you usually don't want to put sashing between them. You can, but the pattern sticks out without it better. And then this one, which is a pretty busy block, but this is a great block for scraps. Just using up all your scraps, and it makes a real interesting pattern when you put them all together. They don't just look like strips. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this. Tomorrow we will lay them all out, and we will put our sashing around them and put the quilt top together. It calls for a border too, and I'm going to put a border on it, but I ordered some fabric for that and it hadn't gotten here yet. So let's hope it's here by tomorrow and we can go ahead and do the border at the same time. If not, I'll have to do a separate video on that. And then I'm going to send this off to be quilted at a long arm quilter, but I'm thinking about trying to quilt on my machine the other one, the sample ones I've been making, just to try a little more at free motion quilting. That's something I haven't really liked that much, but I'm thinking about trying it again. So join me tomorrow and we'll see what this quilt turns out looking like. Thank you. Remember, whatever you do, do it to the glory of the Lord.